Welcome to Compelling Conversation. I'm your host, Busch, and my guest today is a very special person that I've been so excited to meet. And he is the author of the new book, The Serendipity Mindset. Please give a warm welcome to Christian Busch. Welcome, Christian.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. So, I've enjoyed reading the book, and it's been absolutely fascinating. One of the things that struck me about the book is, we've all gone through experiences where in our lives where we've encountered serendipity, happy accidents. Things have happened where you didn't expect a good result to come of it, and somehow it has led to that. It might be a person sitting next to you on a plane. You start a friendship and things go on. But what I found really interesting about your book was that you talk about the fact that serendipity can actually be cultivated. It is actually a mindset that you can develop. So that was fascinating to me because we've always understood serendipity to be kind of a happy accident that happens accidentally, that you don't actually intend for it to happen. So to get us started, why don't you tell us a little bit about why or how we can cultivate this serendipity mindset and create more serendipitous occurrences in our life. And as you say in the book, the art and science of creating good luck. We'd all love to create good luck. So tell us how that's done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you beautifully kind of framed it as in, I think when we think about luck, we usually think about this kind of blind luck, right? Things where we inherit something, we're born into a good family. It's a lot of things that just happen to us. But what I'm really excited about is this question of how do we create smart luck? This kind of luck that's all about proactive decisions where we have to do something. Imagine this kind of quintessential situation. You're in a coffee shop and, if you have slightly erratic hand movements as I do, you spill a coffee and you spill it over this wonderful person next to you and you sense some kind of connection. And now you have two options, right? Option number one is you just say, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Here's a napkin. And then you walk out and later you think, I should have talked with this person. Option number two is, let's have a conversation. And then maybe, you become co-founders, you become love partners, whatever that is. And the point here is that something unexpected happens and our reaction to that essentially then defines what comes out of it. And if you think about, 50% of inventions and innovations in history have been serendipitous, everything from, Viagra to penicillin to other things. But also if we think about what really shaped our lives, we're planning out stuff, but then this kind of bumping into someone happens or bumping into some kind of information, we connect the dots and then essentially that's how we end up and it shapes our life. And so I've been super fascinated by this question of how do we cultivate this? And that's been a lot at the core of both my work and my research, that the most purpose-driven, successful people around me, they do it intuitively. And there's very simple steps. And a lot of the book is really around this, like both where does it come from, but also what are simple, small exercises. To give an example, there's this wonderful entrepreneur in London, Ollie Barrett. If you would ask him this kind of dreaded question, what do you do? He would be like, oh, well, I'm an education entrepreneur, recently started reading into the philosophy of science, but what I'm really excited about is playing the piano. So what he's doing here is he's giving you 3 potential hooks where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. I just started hosting piano matinees. We should have you over. Whatever it is, the point is he seeded potential dots where you can connect them and say, oh my God, such a coincidence, depending on what you're interested in. I think that's the beauty of serendipity, that a lot of times it can be us connecting dots, but also it can be the other person doing it for us.
That is truly, truly beautiful because, the natural tendency is for us to feel like, oh, I don't want to impose on the other person by telling them, all about myself. So in your example, you spill coffee on the person sitting next to you at the coffee house. And for most people, the natural reaction is to say, oh, I'm so sorry, please forgive me, let me buy you another coffee, or something like that. And that's the end of that, because you feel so embarrassed about having spilled the coffee on the person that you're hesitant to take the conversation any further. But your point is really goes beyond that. It goes beyond not just not being embarrassed and continuing the conversation, but it also brings up, a couple of data points about yourself that you can share, which might cause a serendipitous reaction to occur. That is truly beautiful. So for example, I think to take your example a little bit further, you say, oh, I'm so sorry. I was just so engrossed in this book. I love to read, and this book is about photography, and I enjoy photography so much. And so it was just such an engrossing book that I didn't realize what I was doing. And so the person says, oh, you read and you like photography, and clearly you like coffee. So there are 3 data points. So that's really, really fascinating. And now, is this something, in your opinion or in your research, do you find that some people are more naturally disposed to this? Like, for example, are extroverts more likely to be in serendipitous situations? Or is it something that can be cultivated? I think your argument in the book is that you can cultivate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really liked how you expanded that example. I might use your version in the next conversations, but yeah, exactly. So it's interesting because if you think about the traits that some people have that might, foster serendipity, more extrovert, like if we look at extroversion, introversion on a kind of continuum, and the more extroversion, yes, like we might bump into more people, we might keep in touch with more people, and all these things in a way potentially enable us to have more serendipity triggers. But at the same time, I've been fascinated also by how much value there is in introversion. In terms of, if you think about that, a lot of times serendipity also has an incubation time, right? These moments where you're in the shower on Sunday morning and you have this eureka moment of, oh my God, it clicked. That is because our subconscious worked on it, right? Because we had to somehow either subconsciously or consciously reflect on it. And a lot of times, actually, introverts are pretty good at reflecting, at filtering, at trying to understand the meaning in something. And so I've seen the value of introversion both when you have an introvert partner who helps you filter, who helps you make sense out of things, but also when essentially it comes to saying, okay, there is this serendipity happening, but what does it mean for my own life? And one thing, of course, of serendipity is that it comes out of interaction with people, but a lot of times it comes out of interaction with reading a book or looking at a newspaper, or you walk outside and you see something in the shop and then you connect the dots. And so there's a lot for introverts as well to do that. But I think, to your point, we can train ourselves in how we connect the dots differently, how we, for example, use every conversation that we have to directly think about, oh, whatever they say, how does it relate to something I've been doing, a friend of mine has been doing, a colleague of mine has been doing. And once we train ourselves to see dots everywhere, we start connecting intuitively, and then we start making introductions, and then karma happens, right? And serendipity happens all the time.
That is truly fascinating as well. Now, I'm also wondering, as you're describing this, I'm wondering if creative people are more likely to encounter serendipitous circumstances. So, we've read a lot of research that says that when you give vent, or when you give outlets for your creativity, then that supercharges your brain in several ways, and you might be able to see connections where previously you might not have been able to do that. So from your research, have you found any connection between pursuing creative activities? So, for example, we talked about photography. So photography, or painting, or writing, or dance, or music, or whatever it is, that unlocks this, different neural pathways. So is it likely that somebody who engages in creative pursuits is better able to find serendipitous opportunities and connect the dots? Or are we all pretty much in the same boat?
Yeah, it's interesting because if you think about what allows us to see something in the unexpected and to connect dots, a lot of times it comes to, in a way, being able to not be too rigid in our ideas of what the world is about, how the world works, and everything else. And one of the things, of course, that creativity or creative activities teach us is to say, there can be beauty in everything, right? There can be beauty in imperfection. There can be beauty in something not working out. If you think about where most of the serendipity comes from, it is usually spilled chemicals. It is things that didn't work out, spilled coffee, right? Things like that. And one of the things that comes from, I think, creative activities is that we train ourselves to be open to the unexpected moment or the unexpected kind of things happening. And so I see it as a Venn diagram where, like, creativity and serendipity have a lot in common in terms of it's so much about like seeing something and connecting something, and then the serendipity kind of coming in that process. But it's fascinating because I remember Steve Jobs whenever he would talk about creatives, right, and he would be very much into this idea that creatives always feel guilty because people always assume they worked a lot on something and an idea or something, but it just came to them and then they felt guilty that it came to them. But I think what I would compliment, or what I would add to that is that, but they worked really hard to putting themselves into that state, right? And I think that is essentially the mindset to say, if you work hard for seeing things in the unexpected, then you start connecting these things. And yes, it always feels easy that it came to you, but you worked really hard to set yourself up for it.
Sure, and I think that's the premise of your book, which is that you can train yourself to find these serendipitous circumstances, to find these connections where perhaps to an untrained eye, there is no connection. These are just random things that are happening. You spill coffee, or it was an unfortunate incident, all right, you apologize and you move on. Or you sit next to someone else on a plane, on a flight, and then you put on your noise canceling headset and you open up your book and you read, and that's it, the flight's over and you move on. But instead, I think if you exercise those faculties of finding those connections, and even unconsciously being aware of the possibility, then I think that opens up more opportunities for connections and serendipitous discoveries, as you mentioned in the book. So this is truly, really life-changing in many ways for many people, I would imagine, because while we've gone through life pretty much thinking that we live in a random universe, that things just happen and there's no grand plan, and some things happen for the good, some things happen for the bad, and oh well, life just happens to us. But the point that you make in the book is very encouraging and truly very empowering, where you can actually make your own luck by looking for those connections. So for the benefit of our viewers here, would you mind taking us through like just one or two or three little tips that you would give? And obviously there's more, there's a wealth of those tips in the book. But before we get to the book itself, would you mind giving just, 2 or 3 tips that our viewers and listeners might go, okay, I'm going to try that on, the next opportunity I get?
Yeah, I'm a big fan actually of using the things we're anyways doing already and doing them slightly differently. So it doesn't really add any kind of additional workload or something, but we're directly building that in. So for example, when we meet new people anyways, is our first question, what do you do? Or do we ask more, what's on your mind at the moment? Or what are you interested in at the moment? Or something that in a way opens up that kind of potentiality of whatever could come from the other person, rather than just trying to directly box them into something. And so I think it's these kind of, asking questions slightly differently, and also what I just mentioned, answering questions slightly differently. I think your example was spot on to say, the way how you essentially then interact with a person when you are in a situation, and giving them some bits of information without oversharing, right? Like always kind of like when someone asks me, what do I do? I use the same amount of words, right? I could tell you in 3 sentences that I'm working at NYU and do X, Y, Z, or I could tell you, look, like I'm excited about this at the moment, but I've also been exploring this and this. And then I see what the other person comes back with. And so I think there's a lot in, and I'm a big fan in starting a serendipity journal, which essentially, when you're thinking about what are all the opportunities during the day, being that conversations, being that if we have to walk to work, like maybe taking another like street, or when we have a call with someone, asking slightly different questions, even if we know them since 10 years, instead of asking what do you do on the weekends, maybe asking something like, what happened on the weekend and was there anything interesting, whatever it is, just something that comes out. And I think the same in companies, by the way, you know how meetings a lot of times start with, what are the sales numbers? What are this and this? And once we reframe that a little bit and say, what surprised you last week? Was there something unexpected in the data? Then people actually a lot of times say, oh my God, yes, we realized that customers ABC didn't buy ABC. And then what it does a lot of times is both that it cultivates serendipity, but also it actually cuts costs, because we see things that don't work much early on, because we're actually incentivizing people to be more open about it. And so I think a lot of the kind of these small tweaks are about saying, how do we allow each other to essentially constantly think in terms of connecting dots, but also then how do we allow ourselves to reflect on it via something like a serendipity journal, where we write down these things. And once we start doing this, once we are open to that, it starts to happen all the time. And I think we had this conversation about this experiment, which is still one of my favorites, about the priming, that once we prime ourselves, it happens. So, this experiment being someone who self-identifies as extremely lucky, someone who self-identifies as extremely unlucky, and they are being asked, walk down the street, sit in the coffee shop, grab a coffee and sit down. That's it. What they don't tell them is hidden cameras across the street, £5 note in front of the door, and inside the coffee shop, only one empty seat with this super successful businessman next to them. And, lucky person walks down the street, sees the £5 note, picks it up, goes inside, sits next to the businessman, has a wonderful conversation, gets a business card, and that's that, maybe an opportunity coming out of it. Unlucky person steps over the £5 note, goes inside the shop, sits next to the businessman, ignores them. That's that. And at the end of the day, they ask both, so how was your day? Lucky person says, it was amazing. I found money in the street. I made new friends and potential opportunity coming out of it. Unlucky person just says, nothing really happened. And to me, that is the biggest thing, that in a way, the way we look at the world, the way we frame the world, if we, once we start priming ourselves toward it, it starts to happen all the time. And I see that in workshops. I do a workshop 1 week, and the next week, you have people saying, oh my God, serendipity starts happening all the time because you opened your eyes to it. And I'm sure you have that in your own life as well, right? Once you do that, it starts happening all the time.
Absolutely. This is very interesting. There's almost a meta connection to what we're talking about, because from this very show, Compelling Conversations, where I've done interviews with a lot of different people, there have been so many interesting developments that have come up from people that I've interviewed. And it's not necessarily, purely business related or anything like that. Some of them are. But, you have a conversation with someone, and the fact that it's being recorded and it's going to be on YouTube is fine. It's a bonus, but it's really the whole nature of this show is really two people having a conversation about an interesting topic. Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting how out of this conversation comes some additional realization about the other person, or they about me, and it starts a friendship, it starts an association, and out of which many, many good things have come. So it's a very meta thing. The other thing that you mentioned, which I really, really like, and I haven't done this, and I'm going to do this, I'm resolved to do this. And this is start a serendipity journal. I think that's a fantastic idea. So from a practical perspective, what would you do? Would you write down instances that occurred that are random? Or would you write down specific instances where something serendipitous actually happened? What's the best way to get that going?
Yeah. I mean, the way that I found super useful is to identify, if you have the book, to identify the key exercises, I don't know, 3 or 4 exercises, asking questions differently, answering differently, and then writing down what are the conversations today and this week that I have where I hold myself accountable to ask these questions differently and to have these kind of this differently. And then afterwards reflecting on it. When went well? Did something feel strange? Because obviously asking questions differently can feel strange, right? I worked in London for 10 years, and if you would ask someone something like what makes you come alive or something like a bigger question, of course, like people will be like, whoa, 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 like this is a lot at once. And so it's also like finding a good balance, which questions feel most intuitive and that fit the kind of respective context. And I think like then by essentially reflecting on these moments and saying, oh, okay, this is what worked, this is what didn't work, but also in a way, like at the same time reflecting on what were the unexpected things that came out of it, or more generally that are happening, and how did I respond to it? And did I respond in the way that felt most authentic or most real to me? Or do I have to find a better way to do that? And I think that comes to a point, I think we had that conversation at some point around, what do I connect the dots to? Like if the two of us have a conversation now and you're telling me about this amazing new product or projects, you know, I ask you maybe what are you interested in at the moment? You're telling me I want to set up a podcast in China. And I'm like, oh my God, such a coincidence. My good friend is currently in China and doing X, Y, Z. And what always helps, of course, there is to also have a North Star, some sense of direction where I know this is where I want to go next, and this is how it could fit to that. And I think one of the things that the Serendipity Journal as a third point can really help us with is to really write down our story of self and in a way trying to understand who do I want to be in this world, and how do these things relate to like my core kind of sense of direction that I want to have and getting there. And I had a wonderful conversation yesterday with a friend of mine about how she used a question. She wrote an email to 10 of her best friends and said, what is my superpower? What is something that when you look at me that you think like I'm doing better than anyone else, or that you feel is most authentic to me? And she got all these surprising responses where I was like, wow, I wasn't aware that you see that in me. And then she realized, oh, but that is actually me, but I was maybe too shy to admit that, or whatever it is. And so I think, you know, becoming like more clear about what is it that we're actually anyways doing, but also where we're headed, helps us then to connect these things easier and develops that story of self differently, I think, than we would usually do it.
I think that's really valuable. I think from a practical perspective, creating a serendipity journal in that way that you just described, I think would be very powerful. So the one final thought that comes up in my mind is there is obviously a cultural component to this as well. So you grew up in Germany. You lived in Heidelberg for a very long time. It's a beautiful, beautiful city, but you know, Germans tend to be a little more reserved. They're not like the Americans. You go into a coffee shop in America, you can sit down next to someone and start a conversation, and it would largely be okay. In Germany, not so much. Or in London, for example, you couldn't go into a pub, sit down next to someone that you don't know, and quickly start a conversation in the way that you would. So what is the cultural factor that applies to this? So if you were sitting in a coffee shop in Heidelberg, for example, and you wanted to start a conversation with someone, do you feel like we need to pay attention to the cultural differences, or would you suggest just be yourself? I mean, if you're a gregarious, outgoing person, there's no reason for you to be anything different. Or do you think that there should be some sort of cultural filter that we need to place over it?
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm in two minds there in terms of, in my head, this is all a numbers game, right? That in a way, the more we have those interactions, at some point something will be there, and it is more likely, obviously, with someone who's aligned with us in terms of our way of how we approach questions in life and everything else. So it's almost like a filter. Those people who react positively to our more outgoing ways of life, it almost filters those out who are not. But and to your point, I think there's a huge cultural component. I mean, I lived for a long time, for example, in Russia and in Mexico, which are the opposites of a spectrum. And like, exactly. And, you know, in Mexico City, you would just like talk with everyone. And then in Russia, you would be like, better don't, right? And so same with Germany. And one thing I found interesting is that when I'm in cultures that are a bit more reserved, and so to find better excuses, right? Because yes, in Mexico City or in New York, you could just start talking, right? And the other person wouldn't think of it because you would be like, yeah, you're just having a conversation. Versus like in Germany, you would just think, okay, what does this person want from me now? Do they want money or something else?
Exactly.
And so I feel there it's a lot about the excuses, right? And I think things like a spilled coffee, think, I'm not advocating for spilling coffee on purpose, but like I am advocating of creating situations where you have an excuse to talk with the other person. And I think that is in those contexts, again, I think we then vary the questions we ask. We ask questions that maybe a bit kind of less intrusive than we would in other contexts. But, you know, as I said, I think this is really, I felt in Germany as secure as I felt in London, that when you have a relatively unobtrusive way of doing that, that usually people respond to it quite positively if it's done, especially the way you mentioned earlier. I love that way how you framed that with the coffee, you know, and then directly, oh, I'm sorry, I was so deeply reading, I was so deeply immersed in this book, and I've been fascinated by XYZ, and just giving them an in, and if they don't react to it, that's that, right? I mean, what's the worst thing that can happen? And I think philosophically, that's to me, you know, the biggest takeaway, that I feel that, you know, the things that I regret are not the things that I have done, right? I've never regretted that I talked with one more person, but I've regretted the ones I haven't talked with. And so I think it's, once we reframe it for ourselves also, it takes a bit the barrier away from doing it.
Absolutely. That makes perfect sense. I tell you what, this has been a fabulous conversation, Christian. Thank you so much. And so the book is now launched and it's available everywhere books are sold?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. The Serendipity Mindset. This is Dr. Christian Busch, and he is also lecturing at NYU. Christian, for people that might want to reach out to you or connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
So the homepage is theserendipitymindset.com. Then on Twitter, it's @ChrisSerendip, and LinkedIn, it's Christian Busch. And in the spirit of serendipity, delighted to connect if there's any kind of overlaps that anyone felt could be there. Delighted to be in touch. Beautiful.
Christian, thank you so much. This has been an absolute delight. And when the book hits 1 million copies sold, which I think it will, please come back and talk to us. We'd love to have another conversation.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.